this week, we're all going to be looking at a design argument for the existence of God. So, with that said, why don't we all bow our heads for a word of prayer. Dear Lord, would you open our ears and sharpen our minds and just give us the attention and your grace to understand the wonderful and improbable things that you do for us. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so design. We're talking about the argument from design. Now, before I go any further, I will want to first say that this argument is going to have almost nothing to do with the debate between creationism and evolution. That is not what we will be talking about. That topic, I believe, has become sort of emotionally charged, especially in the popular sphere, and we want to kind of stay out of the muck here, so we're going to take a different tack. With that said, I do want to say that before I leave this topic alone, I believe that the thinking Christian can come down on either side of the argument and remain consistent in their belief system. I think that the thinking Christian doesn't have any dogmatic commitment. They have the ability to follow the evidence where it leads and affirm the position that they think is convincing and that they believe is accurate. So, rather than biology, in making our argument from design today, we will stay with a more big picture cosmological theme. For ages, mankind has looked up to the sky and seen that the cosmos is pervaded by order. The stars turn in the heavens, the planets go through their cycles. This order greatly inspired the ancient Greeks, who used it as the basis for their belief in gods that delivered the world from chaos. One might also think of the Apostle Paul, where he writes in Romans, "Ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made." Clearly, even before modern science, people understood from what they saw that the universe itself provides powerful evidence for a designer. The argument from design we will be making has to do with the fine-tuning of the universe. Fine-tuning. What is fine-tuning? I'm glad you asked. Fine-tuning is this. Scientists used to believe that whatever the universe looked like in its early stages, that with enough time and a touch of luck, that life could generally come to be anywhere in the universe, eventually. However, as we have grown more precise and more observant in our measurements, that assumption began to be called into question. There are many, many properties of the universe that have a bearing on whether life can exist in the universe or not. And what we've discovered in recent years is that these factors have to fall within an imperceptibly small range of values for life to be possible. So what are these properties of the universe? They are constants and quantities. They are numbers. They're part of the models that we use to describe the universe. For example, take Newton's law of gravity. This was discovered in the 1600s by Sir Isaac Newton, the guy who had an apple fall on his head. Isaac Newton used his law of gravity to describe how much gravitational force two different objects feel. So let me write Newton's law of gravity up on the board. Again, you don't have to write this down. This is for illustration. Fg equals g m1 times m2 over squared. The force of gravity is the mass of object 1 times the mass of object 2 divided by the distance between them squared times this weird number g. What is g? G is a constant of the universe. It's the same everywhere. It's what we have to multiply this by to turn it into a force. And it's just a property of the universe. It's just a number. Scientists can figure it out. If you take something where you know the mass of object 1, and you know the mass of object 2, and you know the distance between them, and you measure the force, you can figure out what G is. And scientists have figured it out. It's a very, very small number, which would have a lot of zeros, and my hand is really tired from writing zeros, so it's a very small number, but it is just a number. Given the way that we measure masses and distances and forces, that's what we have to multiply it by to get out the force. But here's the thing. There's nothing really special about the value that G has. The laws of physics would work equally well if the value of G was 1, or a third, or 267,000. It doesn't matter what the number is, it's just the laws of physics would work equally well. But here we come to the problem. For the universe to support life, the value of G can't just be anything. It has to be small enough that the universe doesn't just collapse down on itself. But it has to be large enough so that there's enough gravity so that particles can fall together and create stars and planets. And it turns out that the acceptable range for this number is extremely small. In fact, the acceptable range is 1 part in 10 to the 100. That's the acceptable range for the value of G. Now, when we use this little to the notation here, the little exponent notation, what I mean by this is this smaller number up here is how many times we're going to multiply this by itself. So 10 to the 2 would be, so here we go, 10 to the 2, this is the same as 10 times 10, which is 100. 10 to the 3 is 10 times 10 times 10, 3 tens, which is 1,000. This is 10 to the 100. It's 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. On this board, it would be somewhere right in between here. So let me get my marker here. So the value of G is going to be somewhere in here. Now, what I mean by fine-tuning is, imagine a dial that you could turn to set the value of G. We'll label that G. If you turn this dial by just 1 part in 10 to the 100 of the value that G currently has, the universe doesn't support life. And if you turn it the other way, by again 1 part in 10 to the 100 of the value that G currently has, the universe doesn't support life. That is the tremendous fine-tuning of the universe. The range of acceptable values is incomprehensibly narrow. Another example is the atomic weak force constant. Inside an atom, the atomic weak force is one of 2 forces that keeps the atom together. But again, its value has an extremely small range if the universe is going to be life permitting. Too small, the atoms just fly apart and not even basic chemistry can happen. Too large, and the atoms are held so strongly that nuclear fusion couldn't happen and the sun couldn't shine. The range of life-permitting values for this constant is just about similar to G. It's also about 1 in 10 to the 100. So I'm going to put this right around here, the weak force, the atomic weak force. Or, take the cosmological constant. We talked about the cosmological constant last class when we were discussing the Coulomb argument. The cosmological constant is basically the rate of expansion of space. And that also has a bearing on whether life is possible. If it's too large, there isn't enough time for the stuff of the universe to collapse down into stars, so there wouldn't be any stars. If it's too small, again, gravity ends up pulling all the matter of the universe back down together, and the universe ends before it can really begin. The cosmological constant is fine-tuned to precision of 1 part in 10 to the 120. So right underneath this value right here. So I'm going to make that a C for the cosmological constant. Here's one more example. This isn't so much a constant as a quantity. It's an amount. Last class we talked about entropy. When the universe began, it was in a very low entropy state. So it's scientists needing a value to run their models from. And so this value for entropy is computed, and then they put it in at the beginning of the universe. But the number that scientists have found for the amount of energy, the amount of entropy in the universe at its beginning, the odds of our universe having that amount of entropy by chance are so low that the scientist Roger Penrose has calculated the odds to be, are you ready? 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123. 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123. Let's stop for a moment. I want you to take a look at this number, 10 to the 123 on the board. That's 10 times itself 123 times. Think about that number for a moment. Look at these other numbers. These numbers are enormous. This is the number of seconds since the universe began. This 10 to the 57, this is the precision you would need to fire a bullet to the edge of the observable universe and hit a 1-inch square target. This is the number of particles, subatomic particles, in the entire universe. 10 to the 123 outstrips that by a factor of 10 to the 40, which is itself an enormous number. But that's not the number we're concerned with. That's not the number we're concerned with. The number we're concerned with has 10 to the 123 zeros. The number we're concerned with is 10 to the that.
10 times.
Not just 10 times. It's 10 times itself that many times. Yeah. That's...
Why didn't you write that one down?
Do we have time for me to write 10 to the 123 zeros? I mean, it would take the same... So for me to write 10 to the 17 zeros, if I wrote 1 0 per second, would take me as long as the universe has existed to write down. I couldn't even write that down. I would need, what is that? 10 to the 110 something universes worth of time to write that number down. That's the power of exponents. So that number, 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123, is the odds that our universe would have the low entropy condition that it had at the beginning, purely by chance.
Interested though with your bank account.
Not only are each of these constants and quantities tremendously fine-tuned with respect to each other, but they also need to be fine-tuned with respect to the others. So the gravity and the weak force, not only do they both need to be fine-tuned, but they need to be having the right value with respect to each other. So you get even more, you multiply them together, you get even more improbability. It's crazy. Our minds just start reeling at these incomprehensible numbers. Do you have any questions so far?
So it wasn't flip the coin, in other words.
It's not a coin flip. It's definitely not a coin flip. So, we've been talking about life. Before we go any further, I want to talk about what we mean by life permitting and life prohibiting. When I talk about life, I don't just mean life as we know it. Carbon-based life, life that needs water to survive, life that uses organic chemistry. That's life as we know it. But someone might say to us, well, maybe if these constants and quantities were different, then different life would have evolved. Maybe it would be silicon-based instead of carbon-based. or maybe it breathes methane, or maybe maybe we don't even know what kind of life it would be. Maybe it would be like a weird distributed intelligence that lives in the clouds of a gas giant. Maybe life could adapt if these constants and quantities were in different values. But that's actually not the case. The fine-tuning is more radical than that. I'm defining life here. Excuse me. Go. I'm going to define life here as the ability of an organism to take in food, grow, and reproduce. Life, as I define it, is anything that can take in food, grow, and reproduce. It doesn't matter what it looks like, it doesn't matter what it's made of. Any kind of life at all is taken into account. The problem with the fine-tuning is that it's so radical that even this very broad definition of life would not be possible if these constants and quantities differ by the amounts that we said that they differ. Because it's not that it's breaking biological mechanisms in us, it's breaking fundamental mechanics of the universe. Things like basic chemistry would not be possible if these constants and quantities fell out of the ranges of values that they lie in. Give me 1 second. The universe has to be tremendously, delicately balanced just to give any kind of life a chance. Not even life as we know it, life in general. So when I say the terms life permitting and life prohibiting, I mean life in this very broad sense. Anything that can take in food, grow, and reproduce. A life permitting universe is a universe where the constants and quantities will allow that. A life prohibiting universe is a universe where the constants and quantities don't allow that. Now someone might say at this point, okay, the universe might seem fine-tuned if we just consider the possibilities with our current laws of nature. But what if we had a universe that operates under a different law of nature? What if it wasn't Isaac Newton's law of gravity? What if instead of the d squared it was a d to the third or a d to the fourth? What if the laws themselves were different? That might permit life at a wide range of values. But that's a misunderstanding of our argument. We're not concerned with what might happen in a universe with different laws than our own. We have no idea how that might work out. We have no idea what those laws might be. We have no idea how likely a universe is to have certain laws. But what we do know is what happens in a universe that has the laws that we have, but with different values of these constants and quantities. And almost every time we change those, the results are disastrous. So, I think we can all agree that the universe is finely tuned. And it may come as a surprise, but the fine-tuning of the universe is actually a widely agreed upon scientific fact. It is considered true by most scientists that the universe is finely tuned. The reason for this is, when we say finely tuned, we don't mean designed, because then we would be arguing in a circle. We'd be using the design argument to say, the universe is the universe is designed, therefore it's designed, right? We're arguing towards design. We need to start at a place that isn't designed. And fine-tuning doesn't say that. All we're saying with fine-tuning is that the dial is very sensitive. That's all we mean. And that's a religiously neutral fact. And it's a scientific fact, as we can see from up on this board. Where we leave neutrality is in offering an explanation for why the universe is so finely tuned. Questions on that? Good. Very good. No, you guys are following. I love it. Okay. So, many people looking at this enormous, fantastic fine-tuning in the universe might conclude that an intelligent designer has designed the universe with these life-permitting constants and quantities in mind, which would explain why they fell into such narrow areas. That's the thrust of the teleological argument. The teleological argument comes from the Greek word telos. Telos. It means something like purpose or goal or design. That's the teleological argument. However, of course, many people looking at the fine-tuning in the universe might conclude instead that while it may look designed, there's some better way to explain how this powerful fine-tuning arises. There are generally 3 live options to explain why the universe is fine-tuned. The first is necessity. You can see this in the first premise on your outline. The first live option is necessity. That the universe had to be. Huh? Did you not get outlines? Oh, they put them on the pack. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. Whoops. My bad.
That goes back to one, something from nothing.
Right, exactly. Something from nothing. These ones came from the copy machine.
You got a copy machine that does that.
Okay. Cool. Sorry about that.
Thought we weren't gonna just get one.
Yeah, you thought that all the zeros were going to make up for it, right? Okay. There are, generally speaking, this is the first premise, the one with a little number 1 next to it. There are generally 3 live options that could explain why we see the fine-tuning in the universe that we see. The first live option is physical necessity. That is the idea that the universe had to be life-permitting. It couldn't have been any other way. The universe could not possibly have been life-prohibiting. It had to be life-permitting by the laws of nature. The second possible explanation is chance. The universe doesn't have to be life-permitting. It could be life-prohibiting, but it just happened to be life-permitting. And then the third option is design. That an intelligent designer has designed the universe in such a way that it does support life. The objective of the teleological argument is to show that of these live options, design is the best explanation. So, with that said, let me write down the argument. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to physical necessity chance or design. That's premise 1. That's what we just talked about. It's one of these 3 things: physical necessity, chance, or design. Not due to physical necessity or chance. The second premise, it's not due to physical necessity or chance. Therefore, it is due to design. Once again, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to physical necessity, chance, or design. It is not due to physical necessity or chance Therefore, it is due to design. That's the argument. It's a very, very, very simple argument. It has two premises and a conclusion. I think you can all see, as I erase this, I think you can all see that this argument is at least valid. If we took these two to be true, I think you could get from this, all this is doing right here is listing alternatives. And then this one shaves away this alternative and this alternative, leaving us only with this alternative. So the argument is valid. The only question that we have is, are these two premises true? Well, I think little needs to be said about this first premise. We're just listing alternatives, right? If somebody else thinks that they have a different option, then let them list it along with the others. But for the most part, these seem to be the three live options that we have. So the crux of this argument is going to depend on number two. We have to show, we have to give evidence for the fact that it's not, the fine-tuning is not due to physical necessity or chance. And that's what we're going to look at now.
So we're accepting premise one is true.
Do you have a different version of premise one that you'd like to bring forward?
Nope.
Do you have any other options? Yes.
Are you gonna talk about physical necessity?
Yes, I am. I am. So, there are two options that we're saying that it's not. We're saying that it's not physical necessity and it's not chance. Well, why do we think that? How could we show that the fine-tuning of the universe couldn't be explained by physical necessity? Well, what does physical necessity say? It says that the universe had to be life permitting. That's what that option says. That's the explanation, is that the universe had to be life permitting. And so it couldn't have prohibited life. By its very nature, the universe must permit life. But just on the face of it, that seems a little bit implausible. It seems a little bit crazy. These constants aren't determined by the laws of nature. They're just values. They're numbers. They could possibly have been different. And the laws, the laws of physics would still work equally well, even if they were different. There's nothing that says that the value of G has to be what it is. We actually have to go out and measure it to figure out what it is. So these constants and quantities could have been different. And quantities like entropy are just boundary conditions on the universe. It's not necessary that they have the values that they do. So if
the universe wasn't life permitting, we couldn't measure it.
That is a really great point. I'm going to come back to that later. You've stumbled onto a really great idea, and I will come back to that later. Yes?
Who was that?
Stumble.
Yes. But if somebody wants to use physical necessity as the explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned, then they're going to have to provide some proof if we're to accept this really quite radical line of thinking. But so far, there is none. There's really no proof that the universe had to be the way that it is. And in fact, it doesn't have to be the way that it is. So physical necessity is not a good explanation. It's just put forward as a bare possibility. But a bare possibility doesn't really commend itself to us. Now, sometimes people will talk about what scientists call a theory of everything, or a TOE, a T-O-E. That might sound like a theory that explains the natural laws and the constants and quantities behind them. But that's not what a theory of everything is. Rather, a successful theory of everything would show that the four different fundamental forces in our universe, which is the force of gravity, the electromagnetic force, and the atomic strong force and weak force, are just flavors of a single universal basic force. That's all that a theory of everything would do. Now that would go a long way for physics. That would simplify physics from all these different interactions down to different flavors of this one single force. It would help us integrate the macro world of Einstein's equations with the micro world of quantum mechanics. It would give us a clearer picture into what goes on at the beginning of the universe. But it doesn't give us an explanation for fine-tuning. The closest we've gotten so far to a theory of everything is called superstring theory, or M theory. But even if it were fully defined in a fully successful theory of everything, it leaves some constants and quantities unexplained. For example, M theory requires 11 dimensions to work properly. But it doesn't explain just why exactly 11 dimensions exist. That's a quantity that would be outside the scope of what M theory explains. And so we could use that as a fine-tuning argument to say that the universe has 11 dimensions, it's fine-tuned. Or take the fact that on M theory there are somewhere like 10 to the 500 different universes, different sets of constants and quantities. Each of those universes has the same basic laws, but scientists literally have to guess and check to see which of those universes are viable for M theory. They're just put in, and there's a whole slew of these constants and quantities on M theory that just go unexplained. And so even if scientists were to complete a successful theory of everything, that would not show that the universe physically has to be life permitting. Are there any questions about that? Okay. Cool. So with physical necessity out of the way, we next turn to chance. According to this explanation, we rolled the dice, so to speak, and the constants and quantities happened to fall into the life-permitting range. There's nothing that forces them to be in the life-permitting range, but we humans are, to use an expression of Bob Ross, a happy little accident. The problem here is that the odds against the universe being life-permitting are, as we've seen, far, far too long to be reasonably faced. You can't go up against these hyper-astronomical numbers and say with a straight face that you believe that the constants and quantities all happened to fall into these ranges purely by chance. At some point, you've got to face the fact that this is just too improbable. Now, before we go any deeper into the chance hypothesis, let me clear up a small misunderstanding that people sometimes have about the nature of chance. Sometimes people will say that it's meaningless to talk about the odds that a universe will be life-permitting, because there's only one universe. For example, you can't say that 1 in 10 universes permit life, because there aren't 10 universes to draw your sample from. But that's not what we mean when we talk about probability. So let me show you an illustration of what we are talking about. I have 2 markers, one red, one blue. Take the blue one, you wake up in your bed, the story's over. Okay. Anyway, I have 2 markers, one red, one blue. I'm going to use the red marker to denote a life-permitting universe. I'm going to use the blue marker to denote a life-prohibiting universe. So if we can build a universe that has a certain set of constants and quantities, and we run the laws of physics, we can determine whether it's going to be life-permitting or life-prohibiting. Scientists do this all the time. They run universe simulators, change the constants and quantities a little bit, and we'll see how the universe goes. So, what we're going to do is, we're going to take our universe. It's life permitting, obviously. So now let's take the constants and quantities, the value we know for G, the value we know for the weak force, the value we know for the cosmological constants. Let's take those And let's alter them just slightly, just a little bit. If the universe permits life, I'll put a red dot. If it prohibits, I'll put a blue dot. In the universe that we create after changing them a little bit, let's say the universe is, this one, the gravitational constant is just a bit too strong, so the universe collapses back in on itself right after the Big Bang. So that's a blue dot. So I'm going to put a blue dot right there. Okay? So now, what you do is you repeat the process over and over and over. Find different values of the constants and quantities, change them a little bit, run the universe to see if it permits life. And what you find is that over time, if you do this a lot, you end up with a sea of blue dots and a few pinpricks of red. You end up with a sea of blue dots and just a couple pinpricks of red. Now remember, only one of these universes actually exists, but these are what would happen if the constants and quantities were different. If I were to go grab a universe at random without looking, the odds that I pick a blue one are much, 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 much greater than the odds that I would pick a red one. That's what we mean by saying that the odds are very, 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 very slim. That's what we mean. Are there questions on that? Good. There's another misunderstanding. Oh, yes, yes.
But there's a chance.
There is a chance. That's true. But the chance is 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123. And not just that, it's that multiplied by that, multiplied by that, multiplied by that. You almost can't face down these odds. You just can't. Now, there's another misunderstanding that happens sometimes with the illustration of picking a universe at random. Sometimes people appeal to the example of a lottery. In a real-life lottery, if you sell all the tickets, if all the tickets are sold, it's fantastically improbable that a particular person will win. But somebody has to win. Some lottery ticket has to be chosen. So it would be unjustified for the winner of the lottery to say, well, the odds of my winning were 20 million to 1, and yet I won. So the lottery must have been rigged, right? It would be unjustified for them to say that. In the same way, they say, some universe out of these options had to be picked. So the winner of the universe lottery would be unjustified to think that because their universe exists, it was the result of design and not chance. But the point of misunderstanding that happens here is that we're not concerned with why this particular universe exists. We're concerned with why a life-permitting universe exists. So a better lottery analogy would be one in which there are billions and billions of white ping pong balls mixed together with a single black ping pong ball. You're told that one ball will be selected at random from the collection. If it's white, you get nothing. If it's black, you go home a multi-billionaire. Notice that any particular ball that is picked is equally improbable. No matter which ball gets picked, the odds against that are vastly, vastly improbable. Now, some particular ball does have to be picked. That's true. But you don't care about which particular ball is picked. You care about whether it's white or black. And it's incomprehensibly more probable that it will be white rather than black. So if you do see that the black ball rolls down the chute, you certainly should suspect that the lottery was rigged to make you a multi-billionaire. Or if that's not enough, imagine that the black ball has to roll down 5 times in a row in order for you to win the money. Nobody would deny then that the lottery was rigged, and yet that is a drop in the bucket compared to the improbabilities that we're talking about here. So in the same way, it is true that some universe It might be true that some universe out of this sea of possibilities has to be picked. But we don't care which particular one it is. We care about whether it's blue or red. Life prohibiting or life permitting. And it's just incomprehensibly more probable that it will be prohibiting rather than permitting. So we still need some kind of explanation for why the universe is life permitting. Now we're going to go to your point. Do we really need an explanation, though? Some people say that we don't. Their reasoning has to do with the nature of life permitting and life prohibiting universes. The idea is we can only observe a universe that's life permitting, because that's the only kind of universe that could have life in it capable of observing it. This is called, I'll write it down for you, let me find my pen. This is called the anthropic principle. This is what you were getting at. The anthropic principle says we can only observe properties of the universe that are compatible with our own existence. Or in other words, we shouldn't be surprised that we observe a universe that permits life, because that's the only kind of universe we could observe anyway. We could never observe a universe that doesn't permit life, because there'd be no life there. We wouldn't be there to observe it. We couldn't be in a life-prohibiting universe. And so people will use the anthropic principle as a way to say, well, we shouldn't be surprised that our universe really is red rather than blue, because we could never observe a blue universe. But the anthropic principle doesn't have any teeth. It doesn't really do anything to eliminate the need for an explanation for why a life-permitting universe exists. Let me use an illustration to help make this clear. Let's say you're traveling abroad in a foreign country and you're arrested on trumped-up drug charges. Now, this country doesn't have much in the way of fair trials, and you're denied a lawyer, you're put through a kangaroo court, and promptly sentenced to death by firing squad. They bring you outside, they put you up against a wall. Before you're blindfolded, you see that there are 100 trained marksmen arranged in a half circle around you with rifles at point-blank range. Or, at least as close as they can be, since they're so close to you. Then you're blindfolded and you're put up against the wall and you hear the executioner yell, "Ready, aim, fire!" And all 100 guns go off. And then you observe that you're still alive. That there are no bullets in you. That all 100 marksmen missed. Now, what would you conclude in that situation? Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised that they all missed. After all, if they hadn't all missed, I wouldn't be alive to observe it. So there's really nothing to explain here. No! Of course not! You shouldn't be surprised that you don't observe that you're dead. Because of course, you can't observe that you're dead. You need to be alive to observe things. But that fact does nothing to remove the need for an explanation of why you do observe that you're alive. In fact, because of the enormous improbability that 100 trained marksmen missed a stationary target at point-blank range, I think you'd be justified to conclude that the whole thing was a setup.
There were blanks. You said point blank.
Yeah, the whole thing was a setup. Maybe somebody bribed all the marksmen. Maybe they replaced all the rounds with blanks. Maybe all the marksmen missed on purpose, and it was an elaborate scared straight ritual. Right? But it's clear, there is some explanation. Clearly, this situation was engineered for some reason, by someone. In the same way, therefore, just because humans could never observe a life-prohibiting universe does nothing to remove the need for an explanation of why we do observe a life-permitting universe. We might not need to explain why it isn't life prohibiting, but we still have to explain why it is life permitting in the face of the absolutely enormous odds that it should not be. Are there questions on the anthropic principle?
The tree fall in the woods if nobody's there to hear it.
Save that question, we'll talk about it after. So, as you can see on its own, the anthropic principle is toothless. It doesn't pose a danger to our argument because it doesn't eliminate the need for an explanation. Let's take a quick 10-minute break and then we'll reconvene and we'll talk about something that might be added to the anthropic principle that might give it back some of its bite. So, as we've just seen, taken on its own, the anthropic principle still leaves us with the question of why the universe is fine-tuned in the first place. It doesn't affect the argument, so we could still say that chance is not a good explanation. The anthropic principle is toothless unless it's also conjoined with what's called a many worlds hypothesis.
It's on the tip of my tongue.
A many worlds hypothesis. So, what the heck is a many worlds hypothesis? A many worlds hypothesis will put forward that our universe is just one member of a world ensemble, or multiverse, of randomly ordered universes. Vast and preferably infinite in number. So if you looked at the world, the universe of many worlds hypothesis, it would look something like this. You've got this wider multiverse, and inside the multiverse are smaller universes. This looks very similar to something we saw in our first class. And each of these universes has different numbers for the constants and quantities. And potentially might even be infinite in size. That's a many worlds hypothesis. The idea is if you have enough universes, you can roll the dice of all the constants and quantities enough times, and eventually a life-permitting universe will appear purely by chance. And then the anthropic principle swoops in and shaves away all of the other non-life-permitting universes, so that we would end up, of course, in the only universe that can support life. So if you can roll the dice enough times, and preferably an infinite number of times, you can start to face the odds, the incredibly long odds, against there being a universe that permits life. The modern debate about the explanation of the fine-tuning is centered here. And I think that this is a compliment to the enormous power of the design argument. You have otherwise sober scientists who are embracing this hypothesis with a completely straight face, who otherwise in any other situation would call it a metaphysical extravagance. If the question is between believing in an intelligent designer of the universe versus a multiverse made up of literally infinite universes for which there isn't any physical evidence, then which of those options seems more plausible on the face of it? And if the question becomes, well, which of those options is better supported by the evidence? Well, if you take the Kalam argument from last week and the contingency argument from 2 weeks ago, we have good independent reasons for believing beforehand that a designer of the cosmos exists. And so based on the balance of the evidence, we should fall towards design rather than away from it. Not only this, but I think there are a few reasons for why the many worlds hypothesis, or multiverse hypothesis if you want to call it that, is implausible in itself. First, it may be that the hypothesis itself involves fine-tuning. If we are to accept that there is a world ensemble out there, then the worlds that it generates need to have randomized constants and quantities. And it must include some sort of mechanism for generating the worlds. If the constants and quantities are not random, then we could rightly ask, well then, why does the world ensemble happen to include a universe that permits life? Or if the mechanism that generates random worlds is itself fine-tuned, then the world ensemble as an explanation gets us nowhere. We could then ask the question, well, we want an explanation of the fine-tuning of the world generator mechanism. So if it involves fine-tuning, it doesn't get us anywhere as an explanation of fine-tuning. Secondly, why should we even think that the world ensemble lets us face the odds? For the sake of argument, let's grant that there is a multiverse that continuously generates randomly ordered worlds. We saw from last class that there are good reasons to think that it's impossible for an actually infinite number of things to exist. If that's true, then that tells us two things. Firstly, the world ensemble can't have an actually infinite number of universes in it. And secondly, it can't have been creating those universes for forever. So if this world generator has only been chugging away, creating universes for a finite amount of time, and it's only created a finite number of universes, then that may not be enough to guarantee that a life-permitting world exists. Finally, the many worlds hypothesis has a fatal flaw. But to see just how fatal that flaw is, we'll want to consider how it was originally stated by the German physicist, and I'm going to erase this so you can get his name down, the German physicist Ludwig Boltzmann. Ludwig Boltzmann. As a quick review of something that we covered last class, this will be quick, I promise. We talked about thermodynamics. We talked about the second law of thermodynamics and how it says that the universe is always winding down and expending all of its usable energy. Eventually, when all the usable energy is used up, the universe will be in a state of equilibrium, or heat death. Everything will be cold and dark and dead. And all of the stuff in the universe will be distributed evenly all across all of space. No life is possible. And last class, the question was, if the universe has existed forever, and it's always winding down towards heat death, why is it not already there? Ludwig Boltzmann stepped up to provide a daring solution to this problem. He said, on large scales, yes, the universe is in this state of even mixing, of even distribution of stuff everywhere, and it's in equilibrium. Everything is the same temperature, everything is the same pressure, everything has the same density everywhere. But the particles that make it up never completely stop moving. Last class we talked about the box of air. When you have particles in air in a box, eventually they will go towards this nice, evenly mixed state. But there's nothing stopping them from just happening to move all up in the corner by chance. That's possible. They could do that. But it's tremendously unlikely, just because they're all moving randomly, and it's much more likely that you're going to have a couple of them over here, rather than having them all clustered up into the corner. But if you watch long enough, and you keep track of where all the air particles are, and you watch long enough, you'll see that sometimes there will be a couple more particles of air in this corner, and then it'll go back. And then there will be a couple more particles of air in this corner, and then it'll go back. Because as soon as this is a low entropy state, this is an ordered state, it's not evenly mixed. As soon as this low entropy state happens, the second law of thermodynamics takes over, and it winds back down to equilibrium. and then you just get another one over here by chance, and then it winds back down to equilibrium. So what Boltzmann says is that as a whole, that is what the universe is like. Sorry.
How did he discover that? How did he discover that?
This is his theory. He's putting it forward as a theory to explain why the universe isn't in equilibrium right now. He says it's in equilibrium, it's in an evenly mixed state, but by chance alone, some pockets of particles happen to coalesce a little bit together. They happen to cluster a little bit. And then, of course, the second law of thermodynamics takes over and they go back to equilibrium. But Boltzmann says there's nothing stopping particles from happening to fall together into an extremely well-ordered state, like a star, or a galaxy, or even an entire ordered universe. It's just that it's tremendously unlikely, but it's not impossible. And according to Boltzmann, we have all the time and space in the universe. On his view, the universe as a whole has been in this equilibrium state forever. And so we have as much time as we need to wait for the particles to all fall into a state that is ordered purely by chance. We can keep rolling the dice until we get tremendously lucky and the particles all fall together in just the right way to create our little, or rather big, pocket of order that we see as the universe. Are there questions on that theory?
What was his time frame?
I would have to look it up. I'll tell you after class.
Century? I mean,
No.
Century.
Early, 20th century.
20th.
20th century, yeah. Absolutely. So that's how Boltzmann formulated his many-world hypothesis. It seems like a perfect answer to the question of design. By chance alone, an enormous or even infinite number of universes are formed. A few might support life, while the vast majority don't. But then the anthropic principle comes along, shaves away the ones that don't support life, leaving only the universes like our own that are life-permitting. But scientists almost universally reject Boltzmann's hypothesis because, as I said, it has a fatal flaw. What is this fatal flaw? Because the many worlds hypothesis depends on entropy and chance, smaller worlds are much more preferred on this model. Look at this illustration again. It's much more likely that you might get two particles clustering in the corner of the box rather than 50 particles clustering in the corner of the box. It's much more likely that you'd have two instead of 50. You might get two. If you looked at this box long enough, you would expect to see two particles cluster in the corner many times over and over and over again before you saw 50 particles cluster once. That is what it means for, that smaller pockets of order are much more preferred, because fewer particles have to go against entropy by chance. But if this is the case, if our universe is really like this, then we should be observing a much smaller universe than we do. A huge, gigantic universe like ours, with many different galaxies, and large structures of order, like superclusters and things like that, is overkill as far as the anthropic principle is concerned. The universe doesn't need to be this large for life to exist. There's so much of the universe that's out there that does nothing to support life. In fact, a smaller patch of order, say just the size of our solar system, would serve perfectly well as a universe that permits life. It has a star to give energy, it has a planet to grow and reproduce on. That's what we said life was, right? It's something that can take in energy, grow, and reproduce. A single solar system would work fine for as far as the anthropic principle is concerned. In such a world, there wouldn't be any stars besides the sun. The night sky would be completely pitch black. There would be nothing outside that universe. Compared to that, a universe like the one that we do see is incredibly unlikely. If, as Boltzmann claims, these worlds fall together out of equilibrium by chance, we would expect to see billions upon billions of small solar system-sized universes before we see a single large universe like the one that we see. But we don't see that. We see there is an extremely large universe filled with billions of stars and galaxies. We would have to face the tremendously long odds that the universe just happened to fall into an unthinkably low entropy state. We would have to face the odds, not that 50 of these clustered, but that how many particles of the universe? 10 to the 80 particles of the universe all clustered in the corner at once. And speaking of big numbers, remember the 10 to the 10 to the 123 number that we've talked about at the beginning of class? That number is Roger Penrose's estimation of how likely it is that all the particles would fall into an extremely low entropy state. It's inconceivably unlikely. In contrast, the idea that our solar system, just out to Pluto, just something the size of our solar system would fall together at random, is something like on the order of 10 to the 60, so maybe right here. So I'll just draw a little solar system. That's about 10 to the 60. That's about the odds that our solar system would fall together just purely by chance. I'm sorry, it's not 10 to the 60, I lied. It's 10 to the 10 to the 60. I messed up. So way down on this chart, you have 10 to the 10 to the 123. It's enormous, it's huge. Nobody can understand how large that number is. Okay? We have right here, that's the odds that our universe would just fall together purely by chance. The odds that just our solar system would fall together by chance is 10 to the 10 to the 60. The difference between these two is 10 to the 10 to the 63. According to Roger Penrose, that is utter chicken feed in comparison. 10 to the 10 to the 63. In other words, if we were looking at a universe or a multiverse as Boltzmann describes, we would expect to see 10 to the 10 to the 63 small solar systems before we see a single large, orderly, existing universe. If Boltzmann's theory is true, by all accounts, we should be living in a much smaller universe than we are. In fact, taking Boltzmann's theory as true would require us to adopt a strange sort of illusionism. Listen closely. This is utterly incredible, but it's true. It's actually more likely that particles would arrange themselves, purely by chance, on the edge of a small solar system and give images of a large universe. That's more likely than a large universe actually existing. That may sound a little bit improbable. It may sound very improbable. How likely would it be that the particles would always hit on the edge of that small solar system so that it always looks like the star is always in the same place, and that it looks like they're really there, and that there are really, I don't know, maybe exoplanets orbiting the other stars out there, and that there are really galaxies out there turning and orbiting? It seems incredibly improbable. In fact, we would expect there to just be white noise. But that's more likely to happen than it is for a real ordered universe, like the one we see, to actually exist. And so if we took Boltzmann's theory to be true, we would have to say, based on the odds that we're facing, that the universe that we see doesn't exist. We'd have to say that it's an illusion. We'd have to say that it's more likely that the stars that we see are really just pretty pictures painted on a large sphere at the edge of our solar system than that they really actually exist out there. It would be illusionism. That's what Boltzmann's theory leads to. Even though they seem to be real, they're actually not. They're just illusions. Are there questions on that strange illusionism? We can take this further. Entropy favors small patches of order. Remember, 2 particles instead of 50. What's the smallest patch of order that's observable that we could have? What's the minimum that we need for an observable universe? Well, just a single observer. What's the minimum that we need for an observer? Well, all you really need to observe stuff is just a brain to process the sensory inputs. So what if, instead of a whole solar system, which again we saw was much more likely than our full universe, we shrunk it to just our solar system, what if instead of a whole solar system, a single brain just happened to fall together by a random collision of particles and observed random particles hitting on its sensory nerves in just the right way to give it an illusion of an existing external world? Well, as before, it would seem incredibly unlikely that all the particles would always hit in just the right way to make the illusion consistent. Again, we would expect that at any moment it would collapse into white noise. And for most of those brains that fall together, it does. But even though it's tremendously improbable for it to stay, for that illusion to stay consistent, that's more likely even than a solar system to just fall together from particles by chance. So what we're saying is that somewhere up in here between 10 to the 23 and 10 to the 10 to the 60, that a brain with illusions is more likely than just a solar system. This problem is called the invasion of the Boltzmann brains. It sounds like a bad 1960s sci-fi horror movie, right? But the problem is real. Boltzmann brains, which are the ones with the illusions, they're observers. They're vastly more probable even than just a solar system, which we saw was vastly more probable than our full universe existing. So, if you take Boltzmann's theory as true, the dominant kind of observers that exist in his multiverse are Boltzmann brains with illusions of reality. If you take Boltzmann's theory to be true, you'd have to conclude that in all likelihood, you are a Boltzmann brain. Right? Everything that you're experiencing is an illusion. The chair that you're sitting on, this classroom, the people around you, the sounds that you hear, right? None of those are real, and in reality, those are illusions, and you're just a brain floating in empty space. That's crazy! Obviously, no one thinks that they're a Boltzmann brain. So we have pretty good grounds. So it goes back a little bit to that point that you can't prove it with certainty, but it destroys any way of looking into the natural world, what actually exists. So we have pretty good grounds to reject Boltzmann's theory.
When you talk about the clusters in the corners of
Yes.
this box,
Yes.
how far into this realm does Hubble take us?
How far into this realm does Hubble take us? Good question. So, on Boltzmann's theory, if I could... do you remember the diagram that I drew earlier with, this was the multiverse, and inside of it, it's a different color, it doesn't matter. There were a whole bunch of different universes. Hubble Space Telescope would take us, maybe if we're in a galaxy, maybe right here, Hubble Space Telescope will let us see this universe.
Just that one.
That's all that we can observe. It's a universe. We can't really see beyond the universe. That's another reason why the multiverse or the many worlds hypothesis is so extravagant, because we don't have any physical evidence that these are even real.
So our galaxy is just a small part of
Our
that.
galaxies are just a tiny part of our universe, and then our solar system is a tiny part of our galaxy, and our Earth is a very small part of our solar system. It's very humbling when you think about it. But yes, so again, we have no physical evidence for these other multiverses. And that's one of the reasons why the multiverse, many worlds hypothesis doesn't really commend itself. And so, if we reject the many worlds hypothesis, we can't conjoin it to the anthropic principle anymore. And if we can't conjoin it to the anthropic principle, we're just stuck with the firing squad situation. We still have to give an explanation of why a life-permitting universe exists. It's still, the anthropic principle is still toothless. So, give me one moment, I'm sorry. So, we're still left wanting for an explanation. And so, with all of that gone, I think we can say that it's the fine-tuning of the universe isn't due to chance. Chance is not a good option. We cannot face down these incredible odds, 10 to the 10 to the 123. One part of that, you can't even imagine it. You cannot face down the odds that the universe happened to fall in to these life-permitting ranges by chance. So, we've shown it's not due to physical necessity, it's not due to chance. So, 2 is true. 1 is true. Well, in a deductive argument like the one that we have, if you say that all of the premises are true and the argument is valid, which is what we showed at the beginning, then that means the conclusion is true. We're left with design as the explanation for the universe. That is what is the best explanation for why the universe falls into these life-permitting ranges. Are there any questions on that? Good, good. But wait, we're not done yet. We're not done yet. We're not done yet. We almost got there. But what if the skeptic thinks that design doesn't work as an explanation? What might someone have to say against appealing to design as an explanation of the fine-tuning that we see in the universe? The skeptic, in particular, that I'm thinking of, is Richard Dawkins. And he presents his case in what he calls, quote, the central argument of my book, The God Delusion. So, let me put up his central argument on the board. Don't worry, we'll go through it step by step. This is framed also as a deductive argument, which is what we've been talking about. And you guys, through this class, we've been talking about deductive arguments. And what makes deductive arguments good is that if it's valid and all the premises are true, then you have to accept the conclusion. Or, if you want to go against the conclusion, you have to disagree with one of the premises. So what can we say about this argument? Well, what does Dawkins say in this argument? This is his central argument of his book, The God Delusion. He says, one of the greatest challenges to the human intellect has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design arises. That's the numbers on the back of this board. The natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. That's the conclusion that we just made. The temptation is a false one because it immediately raises the problem of who designed the designer. So Dawkins is saying, if you say the universe is designed, then who designed the designer? That's his question. Then he goes on. The most ingenious and powerful explanation is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. We don't have an equivalent explanation for physics. We shouldn't give up hope for an equivalent explanation for physics, something as powerful as Darwinism is for biology. Therefore, God almost certainly does not exist. Wait. Didn't that conclusion seem like it came out of left field a little bit? Right? The reason it felt like that is because you know how to spot a good argument. A good argument is valid, it has true premises. So, let's take a look. Is this argument valid? What we mean by that is, if you took the best case scenario, that all of these were true, just using the things that are given to you here and the laws of logic, can you get to the conclusion? So let's start by assuming that all of these are true and justified. What can we say? Well, first premise, we want to explain how the appearance of design arises in the universe. Just a quick note here, not even Dawkins denies that the universe is fine-tuned. He says it appears designed. He's affirming that the universe is fine-tuned. He just doesn't think that we should therefore think that there's a designer. So we want to explain how the appearance of design arises. The natural temptation is to attribute that to actual design. It's a natural temptation. The temptation is a false one because it immediately raises the problem of who designed the designer. Well, if we take this to be true, we certainly don't want to fall prey to false temptations. So, we shouldn't attribute the appearance of design to actual design. Then Dawkins starts talking about Darwinian evolution. And he says that it's a powerful explanation, and we don't have an equivalent explanation for physics, and then that we shouldn't give up hope for an equivalent explanation for physics. But he doesn't go anywhere near the question of whether God exists or not. There are no laws of logic that let you take from these 6 steps the conclusion that God almost certainly does not exist. And so, this argument is invalid. It doesn't go through. Even if all 6 of these premises were justified, this argument does not go through. It's a bad argument.
Isn't it equally bad because in number 1, he says the complex, improbable appearance of design, and then yet in his conclusion, almost certainly does not exist.
You know, that's
he doesn't say.
You know, that's really
does
interesting.
not exist.
That's really interesting. You should come to our bonus. Our bonus round. Week number 8. I'll talk about this almost certainly part. Actually, it's really, really interesting. You should come. Okay. So if we can't get to this, what can we get to? It seems like at most, if all of these are true and justified, the only thing that you could draw out of this argument is that we shouldn't use design, the appearance of design, to say that there's an actual designer. That's the most that you could say, even if all of these premises were true.
You can also conclude that Dawkins almost certainly hopes that God does not exist.
Probably.
He's figuring it out right now.
Possibly. But at most, you could say that we shouldn't use design to therefore conclude that there is a designer. But that's the most that you could say. And that statement is compatible with God existing. And not just that, that statement is compatible with us having evidence for God. Sure, we might throw out design as an argument, but maybe we should believe in God based on the Kalam argument we went over last week, or on the contingency argument we went over the week before that, or the moral argument that we'll be doing next week. Or maybe we should believe in God based on the witness of the Holy Spirit in our hearts. Maybe we should believe just based purely on faith. Just throwing out design as an argument doesn't do anything to show that God doesn't exist. And so, Dawkins' argument doesn't get to the conclusion that he wants it to get to. Not only that, it's invalid, but even if it was valid, let's take a look at some of the premises. What can we say about some of these? In number 5, Dawkins here, when he says we don't have an equivalent explanation, he's talking about an explanation of the appearance of design that we've been talking about all night, all the different constants and quantities. He's saying, in physics, we don't have a powerful explanation like Darwinism for biology. But then in number 6, he says that we shouldn't give up hope for an equivalent explanation. What he's doing here is he's expressing his faith as a naturalist that science will come up with a powerful explanation. But that's not evidence. That's not a reason to think that there is an explanation. He's just saying there could be an explanation. That doesn't meet our criterion for truth. That doesn't get us past 50%. Remember, 50% is, it could go one way, it could go the other way. Our criterion for truth is 51%. It doesn't reach that criterion. And so 6, we could say, is false. Or not necessarily false, but it doesn't meet our criterion for truth. But the big problem, the biggest problem is number 3. The temptation is a false one because it immediately raises the problem of who designed the designer. That is a, give me 1 second, sorry, lost my notes here. Sorry guys. Okay. Dawkins is claiming that we are not justified to say that design is the best explanation, because who designed the designer? But I think there are a couple of reasons why this isn't as much of a problem as he thinks that it is. Firstly, to accept something as an explanation, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation, because if you did, then you need to have an explanation of that explanation. And you need to have an explanation of that explanation. And on and on and on and on. You could never explain anything. It'd be like a child. Every time his mother explains something to him, asks why. Oh, well, because this. Why? Oh, well, because this. Why? Oh, well, because this. Why? Because I said so. Right? Eventually you have to end the chain of explanation somewhere. Right? If this was true, if you had to explain the explanation, no one could ever explain anything, and science would be destroyed, among many other things as well. For an example, consider an archaeologist that is excavating a new dig site in a place where they've never excavated before. And they come across pottery shards and arrowheads. And the archaeologist, as an explanation of why the pottery shards and arrowheads are there, says that a civilization designed them, used them, and that's how they ended up in the ground. If we took premise 3 to be true, then the archaeologists couldn't say that there was a civilization until they could explain what the civilization was doing there. And if they couldn't do that, then they couldn't say that those pottery shards and arrowhead came about through a civilization. They'd have to say that they came about naturally due to the formation of natural earth processes. That wouldn't work as an explanation. For an explanation to be good, you don't have to have an explanation of it. That might be a great question, what's the explanation of the explanation? But that's reserved for another time. As a second reason, why should we think that the designer needs to be designed at all? Dawkins seems to think here that a designer of the universe would be just as complex as the universe itself. So that when we postulate it, that there's no advance, there's no step forward in simplicity. We don't get more simple. We're postulating something just as complex to explain a complex universe. But that's just not true. As a being, God is a remarkably simple entity. He's just a mind without a body. That's just one part. Now, of course, a mind can be thinking of complicated things. It could be thinking of math, of calculus, or moral concerns, or planning for the eventualities of the future. But on its own, as a being, a mind is an extremely simple entity. So we are getting more simple. By postulating a mind as the designer of the universe, we advance in simplicity. So, I think we can say that premise 3 is false. Since 3 isn't true, 6 isn't true, then even if this was valid, which we've shown that it isn't, this is a bad argument. In fact, it's doubly bad. I personally have found that far from being an outlier, this kind of bad philosophy is very common from the new atheism movement. It's often that its proponents put up a veneer of intellectualism, but when you look at their arguments, it's clear that they frequently have very little background in knowledge of how to do good philosophy. Though they do make very convincing and appealing writers and public speakers. Again, this is one reason why I think apologetics is much needed today. It allows Christians to put up a response to this movement, to compete intellectually and visibly in the public square. And I think that given the arguments that we've seen so far, and the ones that we'll cover in the next few weeks, I think Christianity is up to answering the challenge. So, by rejecting Dawkins' argument, we clear the way for design as an explanation of the fine-tuning in the universe. And so now we have a third argument in our case for the existence of God. Are there any questions? All right. Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you for sticking through this class. Next class, thank you. Next class, we will be departing from the realms of math and science. We'll be looking at an argument for God based on moral values.